Greetings. I'm Dr. Abdul Mohammad, the founder and director of the Abundant Life Clinic of Washington, D.C. The Abundant Life Clinic was founded in 1986 as a center for alternative therapies and clinical research. Since 1991, the clinic has been involved in the treatment and research related to the epidemic of AIDS that I'm sure all of you have heard about. We would like to discuss today something about our clinical work and research in the field of AIDS, some exciting new discoveries that offer hope to many who have grown hopeless. More and more of us are concerned about HIV because we realize that many people that we know and love have been infected, or in fact, we have become infected ourselves. Gone are the days when we felt secure in the knowledge that we did not belong to one or the other of the special high-risk groups that were so much talked about. Now, increasingly, we recognize that HIV is a disease that can potentially affect all human beings everywhere. In 1991, I was confronted with a young man in the clinic who wanted to know what our alternative was for AZT, which at the time was the standard of care for someone infected with HIV. I told him that I did not have an alternative, but that I was interested in finding out whether such an alternative did in fact exist. To make a very long story short, we began looking in the direction of Kenya, which is a small, poor nation in East Africa, where some exciting news had started coming out about a medication that had been developed there by the name of Camron. Camron, which no longer exists in this form, was said to have created amazing results in people even if they had full-blown AIDS. And so in 1991, I and my colleague, Dr. Barbara Justice, went to Kenya and we learned the Kenyan method of treating HIV disease. This had been described previously in the East African Medical Journal in a series of articles that detailed the scientific research and clinical results of Kenyan scientists and others who were using a substance known as alpha interferon. Camron simply was the brand name of this chemical substance called alpha interferon. And so in one sense, what we are talking about this afternoon is the Camron story. To understand, we first have to talk a little bit about the nature of alpha interferon and its relationship to viral illnesses. Alpha interferon is technically described as a cytokine. Scientists refer to any substance that is produced by cells in our bodies that communicate with other cells as a cytokine. Alpha interferon is a cytokine that has immune modulatory effects, which is to say that the cells that are a part of the immune system change the way they function under the influence of alpha interferon. Alpha interferon causes T cells and B cells and other effector cells of the immune system to function better, especially the cells that are called natural killers, which actually carry out the job of destroying viruses that make us sick. If we can turn to the blackboard, we have some drawings that will help us to understand the nature of the struggle that we are engaged in as we fight the disease called AIDS. AIDS is caused by a human retrovirus that was originally called human T lymphotrophic virus number 3, or HTLV3. But now it is commonly called HIV or AIDS. Like all viruses, we need to understand its natural history. And so the first drawing that we have shows us the basic shape, if you will, of a viral illness, which is to say viral illnesses begin at a certain point in time and create illness, and then they turn around and after a period of time lead to a spontaneous recovery. All of us have had experience with one or another of viral illnesses, and they are generally considered to be self-limited regardless of what we may do in the way of treatment. Most of us, for example, have been infected with the common cold virus. We get infected from another person who coughs or sneezes somewhere around us, and we get infected with that virus, and then after a number of days, we begin to develop the symptoms, and pretty much we had the same symptoms as the person who gave us the cold. We get sick to a point, and then we start to get better. And this is regardless of any treatment that we may take. And so this is the reason that we can say that viral illnesses are self-limited. We can divide the nature of a viral illness into two phases. This first or beginning phase we can call the induction phase. And it means that the virus is active somewhere in the body and it is causing symptoms. And those symptoms increasingly worsen up to a point, and then we begin the second phase or the recovery phase until we are restored back to health. The question that we want to answer as we look at the shape of viral illness is, what causes this turnaround? What causes the recovery phase? Because when we look at the nature of the human immune deficiency virus, or HIV, the one that causes AIDS, we notice that the shape of this illness is different. It begins like other viral infections begin, but then it progressively goes downhill, and we have to ask the question, where is the recovery phase? When do things start getting better after they have gotten worse? And what we notice is that with the shape of HIV infection, things usually progress, or we have learned that they progress to the point of death, and there is no spontaneous recovery. Well, if we go back and say, well, if every other virus has the two phases, why don't we have that with HIV? And this is where we have to begin to understand why this recovery phase takes place. It is because our immune systems respond to any viral infection with the production of alpha interferon. And in fact, the name interferon was given because it is a substance that interferes with the activity of a virus. And so the reason that we have a recovery is because our body produces interferon. And we ask the question, why doesn't that happen with HIV? It is because HIV is the only virus that we know of that destroys the human immune system. So gradually, we lose the ability to produce the alpha interferon that would cause a clinical recovery. If we think about what we have just said, we have now arrived at a new definition of what HIV really means. If HIV means human immune deficiency virus, well, the specific immune deficiency that we have just described is a deficiency in the substance called alpha interferon. Now, anytime that we can define an illness as a deficiency state, then we have taken a giant step in its correction or even towards a cure. If I ask anyone, whether you're a doctor or not, what would be the treatment for someone who is vitamin C deficient? Obviously, the answer is give them vitamin C. And so if we now understand that AIDS, caused by the human immune deficiency virus, has produced a deficiency in alpha interferon, then how should we treat that deficiency? Obviously, we should try giving alpha interferon. This is exactly the thinking of Dr. David Koresh in Kenya in 1988 and 1989, when he was given the charge by the Kenyan government to come up with a treatment for AIDS that by that time had affected nearly 8% of the Kenyan population. He had to find something that was not only clinically effective, but something that was cheap enough that could be affordable by the average Kenyan citizen. Why would he believe that interferon would work? Because interferon is the natural substance that helps us to overcome all viral infections. And so he knew that he was working with the right substance, but in fact, he had to discover the proper way to use it. And this proper way of using alpha interferon is what I call the Kenyan Method, and is the basis of the treatment that we use at the Abundant Life Clinic to treat HIV infection. Well, what is the Kenyan Method? Number one, we use alpha interferon, but in a very low dose. Why do we use a low dose? It is because when the human being is infected with a virus, the body begins to produce the interferon, but only in very minute amounts. And Dr. Koresh measured the amount that is produced and found that it is about 150 to 200 international units of alpha interferon. Well, this is a very, very small amount. And the reason that we call it low dose treatment is because typically interferon that is used for other purposes will begin with doses of 3 million or 20 million or 50 million international units. So certainly a dosage of 150 or 200 international units should certainly be considered low dose. The other distinctive feature of the Kenyan approach was that they used interferon from natural human cells. And these cells produce interferon in several subtypes. So the original medication used in Kenya, called Camron, contained 9 subtypes. And this was rapidly improved upon so that today we are using an interferon preparation that has 16 subtypes. Multiple subtypes work in conjunction with one another and actually help the immune system to conquer the particular virus. And if the virus changes or mutates, the immune system is able to keep up with those changes because of the presence of these multiple subtypes of alpha interferon. The third component of the Kenyan approach was the understanding that the chemical receptors for alpha interferon in the body are found in the back of the throat, in that area that if you open your mouth very wide and look all the way in the back, beyond the tonsils, you'll see bumpy looking tissue. This is part of your immune system, and there are dendritic cells that are in that part of the body that have chemical receptors for the interferon. This is part of the natural defense system of the human body against all viruses. So most viral illnesses begin with a little runny nose, a flu-like symptom, but if you examine what is actually being produced in the nasal passages, we would discover that that is the natural source of the interferon. And so part of the Kenyan method was to make sure that the interferon that was being used for treatment would reach those chemical receptors in the back of the throat. And that's why it is called oral alpha interferon. And so those three components added together give us the Kenyan method that the Abundant Life Clinic currently uses in the treatment of HIV infection. You may ask the question, why are you using this alternative therapy? Why aren't you using the standard recommended treatments, the so-called alphabet drugs like AZT and DDI and DDC? The basic reason is that they don't work very well and they are extremely toxic. And we find that the alpha interferon, which is a natural substance, when it is used properly, as described in the Kenyan research and in our own research that has been accomplished since 1991, we get a dramatic clinical response and with virtually no toxicity. If we turn again to the board, we see that this is the natural history of HIV infection. And in this case, at this point, this would be an individual who had reached a point of being very, very symptomatic from HIV. If there is truly a deficiency of alpha interferon, when you supply the missing ingredient, then you should expect to see a dramatic improvement in the clinical condition of such a patient. And in fact, this is exactly what we see. Although it may take several years from the time of infection to develop severe and multiple symptoms of HIV, yet when we give the interferon to such an individual, we will see a dramatic improvement in their clinical situation. Unfortunately, this kind of dramatic clinical response does not take place in every individual. Remember, the alpha interferon is a cytokine with immune modulatory effects. What this means is that the alpha interferon stimulates the immune system to conquer the virus. And so there must be enough of the immune system functioning in order for the alpha interferon to be effective. In our own research in the United States, we have found that roughly 82% of people in whom we have tried this therapy have had a dramatic clinical response. And unfortunately, 18% did not, probably because their immune systems had reached a point of no return. If we look further, we see that with HIV infection, the CD4 or T cells fall. One of the hallmarks of HIV infection or AIDS is a low T cell count, T cells that carry the CD4 receptor. When we treat with alpha interferon, what happens to the T cell count? Well, in that case, we have to say that the response can be variable. In some patients, the T cell count actually rises back up to normal levels, indicating that the immune system itself is healing, along with the clinical response that we have already described. However, that does not occur in every case. In some cases, there is an improvement, but not necessarily back to normal. And unfortunately, there are also cases where there is a good clinical response, that the people actually feel much better. But in terms of the healing of the immune system, we just don't see much of a rise at all. Those who have the clinical response and whose immune systems also heal back to normal levels, these individuals probably could be treated only on a temporary basis and followed to see whether in the future they would deteriorate and develop symptoms once again. In those individuals who have a good clinical response but yet don't have complete healing or have no healing of the immune system, these individuals will probably have to be treated with alpha interferon indefinitely. One final point. You may be wondering whether or not low-dose oral alpha interferon is toxic. Well, the answer to that is no. When we are using the low or physiologic doses that we have described, we are not introducing to the body anything that the body is not already used to. So therefore, in over 5 years of experience, we don't have a single case of actual toxicity from interferon. Interferon can be toxic if it is used in the higher doses, in the millions of international units, because our bodies are not used to such high doses. There are, however, some side effects that we have seen with alpha interferon. The most common side effect that we see is that it causes an increase in the appetite. And many people who have full-blown AIDS and who have lost weight and have lost their appetites don't consider that to be much of a side effect. But there are some individuals who have not yet become symptomatic, who in fact may put on a few extra unwanted pounds as a result of the alpha interferon therapy. And occasionally we see another side effect in male patients where there is an increase in sexual libido, which is to say an increase in sex drive. And so all in all, we can be very pleased with the safety of low-dose oral alpha interferon as described in the Kenyan research. And because we have been so pleased, and the clients of the Abundant Life Clinic have been so pleased with the clinical results, we were able to take our clinical work to the National Medical Association in 1992 and won the endorsement of the House of Delegates of the National Medical Association. The National Medical Association used its good offices with the National Institutes of Health to open up a hearing on the subject of low-dose alpha interferon. And we are pleased to be a part of the National Institutes of Health's clinical trials known as DATRI 022 that began in April of 1996. Before it is all over, we expect to enroll 560 HIV-positive individuals to test the efficacy or the effectiveness of low-dose alpha interferon. And the day may not be far off when low-dose alpha interferon will no longer be considered controversial and an alternative therapy, but in fact, it will become the main line treatment.
Hi, and welcome to HIV and Politics. Thank you for joining us in our effort to create a forum for the discussion of HIV issues. Hopefully this program will serve to further educate people about HIV issues and research. Today we have in our studio Dr. Abdul Alim Mohammad from the Abundant Life Clinic in Washington, D.C. Dr. Mohammad is one of the leading researchers involved in the effort to treat AIDS and HIV infection. His work has often been and continues to be controversial. Thank you, Dr. Mohammad, for joining us today.
It certainly is a pleasure being here.
Tell us a little bit about the Abundant Life Clinic, the beginning of the research and how you became involved in HIV issues.
Well, the Abundant Life Clinic was founded in 1986 by myself and Dr. Fuljendra Sinha, who is from India. And the original idea with the Abundant Life Clinic was to join Western medical science, in which I'm trained, and yoga science, in which Dr. Sinha is trained. So that was in '86. And then since that time, we've gone on to specialize in many areas that are now called alternative therapies. And we got involved in HIV work in 1991.
And how did you become involved? Did you just read a newspaper, or how did that come about?
No, it actually happened when a young man presented himself at the clinic in January of 1991. I had taken care of his sister for a low back problem and treated her with yoga therapy. And so he came in saying that he was HIV positive, he was taking AZT, and he wanted to know what my alternative was for AZT because he was bothered by the side effects. And I had to tell him at that point, I said, really, as far as I know, AZT is it, and I don't know of any alternatives. But he began to bring me information. In other words, this was a case where the patient was trying to educate the doctor. And he brought me information about a lot of different things. And one of the things that he mentioned quite consistently was something called Camron. And nobody at that time knew what Camron really was. This is the box that it was actually in at that time. But nobody knew anything about it. And I called all the experts and I tried to do research on it, and I couldn't come up with anything. So finally, what I did, I went to see Minister Farrakhan. And I told Minister Farrakhan, I said, I'm hearing so much about Camron. It's said to do amazing things for people who have AIDS, but I can't really find out what I need to about it to find out whether these things are true or not. So he looked at me, and just like that, he said, well, then you have to go to Kenya, because our people need to know whether what you're hearing is true or whether it's not true. And so he sent me to Kenya, where I met Dr. Davy Koech, who is the research director of the Kenyan Medical Research Institute. He was the author of at that time, 5 research articles on the subject. And everything I know about low-dose alpha interferon and how to use it to treat HIV, I learned from Davy Koech. And so in '91, we came back from Kenya, and we began our first series of patients. And what we learned after treating 50 patients was about 82% of people here who are HIV infected at advanced stages will respond to low-dose alpha interferon if we use it in the way that Dr. Koech developed.
How is interferon developed? Is it a natural substance created just for HIV treatment, or a known substance developed for some other purpose?
Well, it's a completely natural substance. Our bodies produce it normally, naturally. Anytime we get infected with a virus, our immune systems respond by producing alpha interferon. And they don't just produce one substance that we call alpha interferon. It's actually a whole family of substances. And according to Dr. Koech, and this is a bit controversial, he says the human being produces at least 31 different subtypes of alpha interferon in different combinations depending on which virus is invading the body. And we believe that it is these combinations of subtypes that is responsible for the success that they had in Kenya, because Camron had 9 subtypes. We're using an interferon now that has 16 subtypes, and we think that it's the multiple subtypes that actually somehow or other inform the immune system of what to do to deal with the particular virus that we're trying to treat.
So that's actually how interferon works against HIV. It
Yes.
produces combinations of these subtypes.
Yes, and then somehow these combinations are, it's like an immune alphabet, if you will. The different combinations are like combinations of letters from the English alphabet, and it's telling the immune system about this particular virus and what to do to eliminate it. And so when we focus on interferon, we shouldn't just focus in on its ability to treat HIV. In fact, alpha interferon is able to treat any viral illness. We may at long last have discovered the cure for the common cold, although right now it's a little bit too expensive to use it for the common cold, but in fact it's useful for any viral or viral-related disease.
What is the difference between interferon and antiretrovirals such as AZT and DDI and the other standard prescriptions for the treatment of AIDS?
Well, the first thing is that the alpha interferon is completely natural. The antiretrovirals and the protease inhibitors, all of those things are synthetic chemicals that have been developed. And as such, the body is not familiar with them. And so as a result of that, you get a lot of toxic side effects. The other thing that distinguishes, at least in my opinion, alpha interferon from AZT and the other alphabet drugs is that the interferon actually works. It doesn't work because it's a poison and kills viruses. It works because it stimulates the immune system to do its job better, and thereby eliminates the virus, reduces the viral load, strengthens the immune system, creates an antiviral effect throughout the body. And it's the natural way that we heal ourselves from all viral infections that we ever had since childhood. The reason why we got over the measles, the mumps, the chicken pox, the reason why we recover from the common cold is because our immune systems produce this natural substance called alpha interferon.
You mentioned before the statistics on your research and the results of the research. Are there different levels of success in different individuals when they use interferon as a treatment?
Yes. In fact, I generally will divide patients into two basic categories. Those who are HIV infected but who have no symptoms, who are completely well, but they are infected. And then the other group are those, of course, who are infected and they have symptoms. And some of those we would say have full-blown AIDS. When I said before that 82% of the patients respond to treatment, that's in that second group, the people who are sick. 82% of them will respond. In the first group, where they're merely HIV positive, if we use the interferon, we can actually prevent the progression of the infection to symptomatic stages. And we think that's the best use for the interferon. Why wait till someone is sick and then try to rescue them? Because you're only going to be 80% or so successful. But if you use it in the early stages, before they get sick, then they don't progress. They never become sick. And since the interferon is non-toxic, no side effects except an increase in appetite, why not use it in the earliest stages?
How long has the substance been tested here in the United States? And you said its origins were in Africa. How long was it tested in Africa? I mean, clearly there's a difference if you have statistics for a year, for 2 years. For the longer your research period, the more accurate the result.
Well, in fact, alpha interferon was discovered in England in the 1950s. Okay, and so the research literature goes back to the 50s. The problem at that time was that the interferon was in such short supply because the human body only produces these very minute amounts. It wasn't until the 70s that there was enough of this substance that was available that large-scale research could be done. And then the antiviral and actually anti-tumor properties of alpha interferon were discovered. And back in the 70s, people may remember, interferon was actually hailed as a miracle cure for cancer. But it did not actually live up to expectations at that time. And now we understand the reason why. It was because those interferons that were used and continue to be used, even up to the present day, that are FDA approved, these are interferons that come in a single subtype and not in the multiple subtype forms that we've been discussing in the case of Camron. And so we think that ultimately alpha interferon will catch up with its reputation and with its potential, but only when we learn to use it in a more natural way, using the low dose form and using the multiple subtypes. That is what our systems will produce under normal circumstances.
You you mentioned the cost of the drug, and you said, oh, it's a bit too expensive to use as a cure for the common cold. but what is the cost in real terms and compared to the other medications on the market?
Well, you know, the Kenyan researcher, Dr. David Koech, was given a charge by his government to come up with a treatment for HIV, I believe in 1988. And part of what that said was, not only do you have to find something that is clinically effective, but you have to find something that is cost effective, something that is affordable by the average Kenyan who earns very, very little. And so when we actually look at the cost of the interferon, if it were being produced on a mass scale, we're talking about something that would literally cost pennies per dose. We're talking about something that would probably end up being about as cheap as aspirin, okay? Now, the interferons that we use in our work are more expensive than that because it's not being mass produced. So it costs about $840 right now to treat each patient per year. Now, if you compare that to the cost of the antiretrovirals like AZT, it's not uncommon for AZT to cost well over $10,000 a year, or DDI maybe $23,000 a year, DDC $28,000 a year, the protease inhibitors tens of thousands of dollars a year. And then when you add to that the fact that often these drugs are used in combinations, that an individual is taking 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them at the same time, it's not unheard of for the drug bill to be $50,000 or $60,000 a year. So we think that in time, especially with the emphasis now on cost effectiveness in medicine, that interferon is going to have its day. It's clinically effective, it's cost effective.
I understand that in the past there were problems importing interferon or gaining access to the substance. What is the history of that access problem, and what's the current status of interferon? Where is it produced?
Yeah, in the early days of our work, we were importing the interferon from Kenya. And in order to do that, we had to, you know, obey certain FDA guidelines that allowed the importation, you know, of substances for medical uses. But there's a lot of complications in doing that, and some of our shipments were stopped, and, you know, it was very, very difficult and very, very expensive, much more expensive than it is now. The other part of that problem is that the kind of interferon that we're using with the multiple subtypes, so-called native interferon, it's not being produced in the United States. You see, this goes back to certain decisions that were made in the scientific community back in the 70s, where there were basically 2 breakthroughs in biological sciences. One was the cell-based technologies, and the other was the recombinant DNA technologies. Well, this country invested largely in the DNA technologies. And not the cell culture technologies. So that the kinds of interferons that we're talking about here are not available from manufacturers in the United States. And in fact, all of the major manufacturers for the multiple subtype native interferon is either in Japan or Cuba. And so that raises political issues that, you know, are a part of what we have to solve if we want to deliver this treatment to people in the United States.
Speaking of political issues, that sort of raises the question of serodeconversion. I'm not sure many of our viewers know what that means. I'm not sure that I understand the full meaning of serodeconversion, but it does raise some political questions. Can you give us some background on that issue?
Yes. Well, first of all, some definitions. Seroconversion refers to what happens when a person gets infected with the HIV, with the virus that causes AIDS. And then they seroconvert, which means that antibodies to that virus appear in the blood. And then the person tests positive, as we say it, to HIV. Serodeconversion is the reverse process, that a person who has been HIV positive becomes HIV negative. And that means that the antibodies to the virus have disappeared. And the only way that the antibodies to the virus can disappear is that the virus has disappeared. And this was reported in Kenya. In their early studies in the use of alpha interferon, they reported approximately 10% of their treated patients serodeconverted, became HIV negative. When I was there in 1991, learning from the Kenyans about this, I questioned that, because as far as my understanding of the current theories of immunology, that's not supposed to be possible. But yet, here are the results staring us in the face. And so Dr. Koech, you know, the scientist that he is, he said, well, I have to report my findings. Whether I can explain them according to current theories or not, I have to tell you what I found. And so when we began telling people about that, I mean, that was almost heresy. It was like Galileo telling people in his day that the earth went around the sun and not the other way around. And of course, he was almost put to death because he was challenging the orthodox teaching of his day. Years and years later, of course, everybody agrees that Galileo was right, because they have a new theory to explain, you know, why the sun comes up as it does every morning and sets as it does in the evening. So I think that we are on the threshold of developing a new theory of immunology, simply because we have to have some way of explaining how could antibodies to a virus become, I should say, disappear. How could that actually happen? And does that mean that this is a cure? You see, now that's a four-letter word that I have not used in any official way, but we have to look at the very real possibility that if the symptoms disappear and the virus disappears and the antibodies to the virus disappear, how long do we have to follow these people before we are ready to accept the possibility that they're cured? So I talked to Dr. Koech recently about those patients of his that serodeconverted in 1988 and 1989. They've now been followed for 5 or 6 years. They're still HIV negative. So Dr. Koech, for the first time, has said there is no reason why we shouldn't consider that those patients have been cured, even though we can't explain how such a thing could happen. Now, one final point. We were always a little bit skeptical of that talk about serodeconversion because we were already in enough trouble just for advocating the use of the low-dose alpha interferon without talking about serodeconversion until September the 22nd, 1995, at the Abundant Life Clinic, one of our patients serodeconverted. And so then I couldn't ignore the issue any longer. And I had to face up to the fact that, well, Koech was right, that this is a possibility. And now we don't know what buttons you have to push to really make that happen. So far, we only have one of our patients who has serodeconverted. But we think that this should give hope in the area of AIDS. It should give hope to people who are infected or who are fearful that they might become infected, because we're on the threshold of some new discoveries that are just as fundamental and important as the discovery of penicillin was to the treatment of bacterial diseases. Maybe if we learn how to use the interferon and other cytokines properly, we'll actually have a cure for viral illnesses.
Moving on to the political front, I made a few calls to agencies and individuals involved with the HIV and AIDS issues, and I asked them about interferon. You know, what is it? Where does it come from? Basically, I received two responses. Either the individual had no information about the treatment, or they were very skeptical about positive results. What's the source of this ignorance, and why does it persist even after positive proven results? I mean, you have objective data supporting your thesis. What's the nature of this ignorance?
Well, none of us are any smarter than what we've read. And the research, the relevant research in this area, for the most part, has not been done in the United States or in Europe. And unfortunately, most of the medical researchers in this country only read the research journals that are published in the Western world. So they don't read the East African Medical Journal. So they're not familiar with what it contains. And I have to say it, I hate to introduce the issue of racism, but I mean, basically scientific work that is done in Africa or other parts of the world is simply dismissed as being second-rate or substandard just because it's from a third world country or some other part of the world. And so I think we have to look beyond that. And I think one of the greatest contributions that the Abundant Life Clinic is making in this field is that we're saying to everybody, hey, look, you know, they're doing some good work in Africa, and you better pay attention to what they're doing, because there's no race of people or no part of the earth or no nation that has a monopoly on scientific discovery. I mean, people are smart everywhere. And if they're trying to solve a problem in Africa or Asia or the Caribbean or South America, wherever it is, they might actually come up with an answer, and all of us, you know, can benefit from it. And so we have to sort of expand our horizons, if you will, and pay attention to what's going on everywhere, and not just in our neck of the woods.
That raises some other issues about your clinic. Recently, your clinic has been the focus of several investigations. I just want to address these, you know, in an organized fashion, I hope, and get your response to these issues. First of all, the IRS. You recently held a press conference where you announced that the IRS had frozen the clinic's assets. What's the background on this controversy or this?
Okay, and let me quickly say that the clinic's assets are unfrozen as we speak, and that's the good news, that we've gotten that little bit of controversy behind us. But the reason that I called the press conference at the time that I did is that we had no information from the IRS about what they were doing. We didn't have a letter or any kind of an invoice that gave us information from the IRS about what was going on. Now, we felt that there may have been some political motivation, because the IRS took action against the clinic the day after we announced the opening of the clinical trials with the alpha interferon. And that made us think that perhaps there was some political motivation, because we had never had any difficulty with the IRS in the past, and as far as we knew, well, we didn't have a tax bill with them. As it turns out, we did have a small tax bill, and we've taken steps now to correct that. And so the levy against us was lifted. But that still does not remove the possibility that the action in the first place was motivated politically, because certainly all the IRS had to do was send us a letter and tell us that there was a problem, and then we would have addressed it as we subsequently have.
The other issue is the investigation by the Department of Health and Human Services. They received a complaint that the clinic was discriminating based on race. I personally read the entire report, and it, you know, the investigation and the research cleared the clinic of any discrimination charges, and found no evidence that the clinic was in fact discriminating based on race. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, we have here an IRS investigation that turns out to be, you know, a very small issue, and now an investigation into racial allegations.
Yes, well, that was a real shocker in 1995 that we received a letter from HHS, their Civil Rights Division, alleging that there had been complaints of racial discrimination. And so I immediately called the staff meeting, and I said, I mean, have we offended someone? I mean, has someone complained? Has there been an issue or a problem that anyone knows about? And they all said, no, we're not aware of anybody complaining or there's a problem that we were aware of. And HHS at that time would not tell us the nature of the complaint specifically, just that there was an ongoing investigation. And so we had to wait several months before that investigation was complete. And then HHS informed us, you know, that the American Jewish Congress had brought a complaint against us alleging racial discrimination, you know, that we wouldn't see whites or Jews or whatever, and that has never been the policy of the clinic. And obviously that investigation in its final report said they could find no instance of any racial or religious bigotry of any sort. As a matter of fact, the clinic staff itself is composed of so many different types of people. I happen to be the only Muslim on the medical staff. Dr. Sinha, that I mentioned before, is from India and is from a Hindu background. The other doctor that works with us every day, Dr. Johnson, good Christian gentleman. And we have someone on the staff from Shanghai, China. And you know, actually I've never asked him, but I would assume he's probably Buddhist or something. I mean, we don't discuss these kinds of issues. I mean, that's not what the Abundant Life Clinic exists for. We exist for the purpose of trying to treat the sick. And we don't much care, you know, about racial identities, ethnic identities, national backgrounds, or any of those other things. So we're very pleased that that investigation found us to be free of any taint of racial discrimination.
Finally, and this is probably the most controversial, Mr. Peter King, a congressman from New York, has stated on the record, and to anyone who cares to ask him, that he objects to the NIH's plan to fund clinical trials for interferon. In fact, when I spoke with his assistant, she stated that Mr. King is adamantly opposed to any federal funding for the clinic. Given the positive results of your research, what's the source of this antagonism? Is it personal? I mean, you know, I'm not a subscriber to conspiracy theories, but certainly if I saw an IRS investigation and then a racial questions raised in a Health and Human Services civil rights investigation, and then I speak with a congressman who is very clear about his dislike of the clinic's activities, I would tend to be a bit paranoid. What was that thing? Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean there's no one after me, right?
Right.
What's your take on Mr. King's position?
Well, Congressman Peter King is somewhat of a mystery. I don't fully understand what his motivation could be. What is objectionable about the clinic's work? If we're helping people to deal with HIV and other diseases, what is the problem there? Isn't this a major problem that our country is confronted with? And why shouldn't we be involved in trying to help those members of our community here in Washington who are HIV infected? I don't understand it. In the past, he seems to be trying to make a name for himself by attacking the Nation of Islam. And I'm a member of the Nation of Islam and have been for 28 years. As a matter of fact, the reason I went to medical school was because, you know, I got so inspired by, you know, the Nation of Islam's teaching to sort of reform myself as an individual and try to make a contribution to society. So maybe it's that. Maybe Peter King is just an old-fashioned kind of a racist bigot or religious bigot, and he's using his high office like Joe McCarthy did years and years ago, you know, just to scapegoat some people and give them a hard time in hopes that it will contribute to his political career. But actually, I really don't know. You'd have to ask him, you know, what his motivations are.
We sort of touched on the Nation of Islam, but we haven't spent a great deal of time discussing the connection. You mentioned that the minister sent you to Kenya initially to investigate the interferon treatment. What is the relationship between the Abundant Life Clinic and the Nation of Islam? Is there one?
Well, from an organizational point of view, no. I mean, it's no different than if someone who were Catholic, who had a clinic, I mean, you wouldn't assume that the Pope was running the clinic or the hospital just because the Catholic doctor was working there or who owned it. And you wouldn't assume that a Protestant doctor was being controlled by whatever denomination. So in the same way, I'm a member of the Nation of Islam, as I already stated, and obviously I look to Minister Farrakhan for spiritual guidance. And in '91, as I said, when I first became aware of some possibilities with Camron as a treatment for HIV, I took it to him to seek his counsel and guidance. And his immediate response was, well, you have to go to Kenya. You have to find out whether this is true or not, or whether it's false, because our people have to know the truth. That's the kind of man Minister Farrakhan is. He doesn't fool around, you know, and beat around the bush. He goes right to the heart of it. And so I was blessed to go at that time and bring back our findings. And I would just say, for the record, on my way to Kenya, I was the biggest skeptic. And I told the brother who traveled with me, who was the editor at that time of the Final Call newspaper, I said, be prepared to deal with the biggest hoax of the century. I mean, that's how skeptical I was, because I just couldn't see how these claims could be true. But when we came back from Kenya, I had been completely turned around, in my opinion, because we were shown everything. The Kenyans were most forthcoming. We were given complete freedom to talk with patients, to look at their records. We went to government hospitals, private hospitals, government clinics, private clinics. We talked to government doctors, private doctors, everybody. And so we came away with a pretty good understanding of what was really going on. And we were very, very impressed. And that started our work here in the United States. So I would just say that the Nation of Islam is involved in the sense that the Nation of Islam has taken the point on a lot of problems in our communities. We've taken the point on drug abuse, for example. We've taken the point on cleaning up crime-ridden neighborhoods. And we're also taking the point on HIV. And it's just a part of our contribution to the common good.
Well, Dr. Mohammad, thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to having you on our show again, and it was a real pleasure speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.